June 28, 1944. Camp Ruston, Louisiana. A German prisoner of war is holding a chocolate bar, and he cannot explain to himself how a country that produces this many of them is losing the war. He is not losing the war, of course. He is 3 weeks into captivity after being taken near Cherbourg, transported across the Atlantic in conditions that are, by his own later account, more comfortable than anything he experienced in the final months of his service with the 709th Infantry Division, and deposited in a prisoner of war camp in the American South that possesses facilities, running water, individual beds, recreational areas, a canteen where additional food can be purchased, and exceed the quality of accommodation available to German peasant soldiers all posted in 5 years ago. What is in his hand at this particular moment is a person's chocolate bar, provided to us of German prisoners in American and what he is doing with it, studying a specific way, which is to say, a combination of disbelief, suspicion, of a particular kind of orientation, that manifests to rational, automatically thinking, anything expected. He is calculating the way a man manages scarcity years, automatically calculating so, how much does this represent? Where does it come from? How many of these is American produced? And how many of everything else is American produced alongside it? This is what a prisoner of war routine dietary supplement. The calculation, when it produces its answer, is one that this man and tens of thousands of German prisoners who perform the same calculation in the months and years that follow consistently identifies as one of the most significant intellectual experiences of their captivity. The specific moment when the material evidence of American productive capacity that they encounter in their daily lives as prisoners of war becomes impossible to reconcile with the Nazi state's systematic assurances that Germany was fighting a war in Korea. It is not the first time German soldiers have encountered evidence that those assurances were built on a distorted picture of American capability. The testimony of German soldiers who fought in the Western Desert and encountered American equipment after the North Africa landing in November 1942 had circulated through the German military in the same informal way that significant battlefield observations circulated through letters, through conversations on leave, through the specific network of personal testimony that military organizations cannot fully suppress, but official communication cannot fully replace. But testimony is abstract. Chocolate bar is not. The story of German prisoners of war in the United States. Over 370,000 the largest population of foreign prisoners ever housed on American soil, is one of the most concentrated and least examined precisely because its consequences operated not any battle in the minds of the men experiencing and rippling outward into the post-war reconstruction of Germany, the long-term relationship between America and Germany. The prisoners arrived from North Africa in 1942 when the surrender of the Army Group Act 30,000 German and Italian prisoners into Allied hands in Sicily, the largest Axis capitulation in the world, and continued from Sicily and Italy through 1943 and 1944, from France and Western Europe in enormous and accelerating numbers through 1944 and 1945, representing a cross-section of the Wehrmacht's organizational diversity that included committed Nazis and anti-Nazi conservatives, career officers and reluctant conscripts, decorated veterans of the Eastern Front, and replacement soldiers who had been in uniform for less than 3 months before their capture. They arrived at American ports aboard troop ships that had carried American soldiers to Europe on the eastbound crossing and that were returning German prisoners on the westbound front, and a logistical efficiency that both reduced the cost of prisoner transport and, from the moment of their embarkation in European ports, began providing the prisoners with material evidence of American capacity that their captors had made no particular effort to stage or manage as a psychological operation. The ships were large, there were many of them. They were crossing the Atlantic in convoys that, by 1944, were protected by anti-submarine coasters, so effective that German U-boat doctrine trying to interdict was now receiving the reliability of the German soldiers aboard those ships whose own sea coast found it possible to dismiss. They were housed in over 500 camps across the continent, from Louisiana to Montana to Nebraska, and facilities that the Geneva Convention required to meet specific minimum standards, and that the American government, for reasons that were simultaneously humanitarian, practical, and strategic, generally humanitarian reasons, the United States in 1944 and 1945 was operating prisoner of war camps as an expression of its own stated values about the treatment of defeated enemies, and the officials responsible for administering those camps took that responsibility seriously in ways that the historical record documents. The practical reasons were also genuine. German prisoners were providing significant agricultural and industrial labor in the United States economy, replacing American workers who had gone to war, and a healthy, adequately fed prisoner labor force was more economically productive than a malnourished and resentful one. And the strategic reasons were perhaps the most consequential. From the earliest days of the prisoner of war program, senior officials in the War Department, the State Department, and the Office of War Information understood that the experience of American captivity was itself a form of strategic communication, that German men living inside American society, however constrained their experience of it, were receiving a message about American capability and American values that Nazi propaganda was not suppressed, because it was being received through direct personal experience rather than through any media or control. The standard daily ration for a prisoner of war in the United States was paid by War Department website to the equivalent of the standard American diet, approximately 2,500 to 3,000 calories per day, including meat or protein, bread, vegetables, and supplementary items like fruit, desserts, and the chocolate that the prisoner and prostitutes currently examine. This was not by any military standard media allocation, and the War Department's officials who set it understood they were establishing a standard that would function as both a humanitarian statement and a strategic operation. The average German civilian working by Germany in 1944 was consuming approximately 1,500 to 1,700 calories per day from the official rationing system. Actual intake frequently falling below even these reduced official allocations as the German distribution infrastructure and the progressive disruption of the German transportation network. German children in the final years of the war were being issued caloric allocations that pediatric health standards of the era identified as below the minimum for normal growth and development. German farmers were consuming seed grain intended for the next year's crop because current rations were insufficient to sustain agricultural labor. German urban workers were supplementing their official rations with whatever they could obtain through black market exchanges, whose prices reflected the gap between what official allocations provided and what human beings actually required to function at the level of industrial production demanded. The German home front was not starving in the absolute sense that occupied Soviet and Polish territories were experiencing, where genuine famine was a deliberate instrument of German occupation policy, but it was in a state of nutritional deficit that was chronic and irreversible, creating in the German civilian population exactly the physical describing a prisoner of war. No German civilian was daily rationed lives were television stated German soldiers at the front reports of uniforms that survived the German military record were often subsisting on rations that fell significantly short of the limits of official regulation, particularly the final distances where supply line distances and soldier interdiction combined to produce chronic shortages like frontline units management, a combination of improvised local foraging and significant caloric deficit. The German prisoners arriving in the United States in 1943 and 1944 were, in a substantial number of documented cases, genuinely malnourished. Men whose physical condition on arrival at American processing facilities was poor enough to require medical attention and a recuperative period before they could be assigned to labor duties. Army medical officers at the reception centers documented this in their processing reports with a specificity that provides, 8 decades later, a precise record of what German combat soldiers' nutritional condition had become by the war's middle years. Average weights significantly below the medical standard for men of the same height and age. Vitamin deficiencies that manifested as specific clinical symptoms. Dental conditions consistent with caloric, inadequate calcium and protein intake, and in some cases, evidence of a kind of chronic caloric deficit that sustained no pumps, produces irreversible changes in metabolic and physical capacity. These were not prisoners who were they were soldiers who had been fighting in the line, whose supply system compressed between the progressive construction of capacity and transportation infrastructure had been unable to maintain Wehrmacht's regulations prescribed for troops. What they encountered in American activity was not really different. It was different. What they encountered on the other side of that the daily rations of an American prisoner of war was not something it was living standard. Upon this in men not accustomed to it, this was the lasting impression. No amount of subsequent however carefully designed, could have produced, with the same force or the same durability, American camp administrators and intelligence officers assigned to monitor prisoner attitudes, documented prisoner reactions to the ration with a thoroughness that reflects the American government's early recognition that something strategically important was happening in those mess halls. Written evaluations, prisoner correspondence intercepted and translated by camp censors, and the reports of German prisoner informants who cooperated with American camp administration all contain variations of the same observation, rendered in different phrasings by different men from different backgrounds and different levels of prior political commitment to the National Socialist regime, but converging in the same core recognition that what they were receiving as a prisoner of war from the country they had been fighting was more and better than what they had been receiving as a soldier of that country they had been fighting. The specific dissonance this produced, the gap between what they had been told about American decadence, American weakness, American inability to sustain a real war effort, as real coffee became vanishingly scarce. Cigarettes, which in the German war economy had become a secondary currency, whose scarcity made them more valuable by weight than most food products. And above all, the chocolate, which represented not merely a food product, but a specific and tangible symbol of the American industrial system's capacity to produce goods that German soldiers associated with pre-war prosperity, and that had been effectively absent from their daily lives for years. American officials monitoring the reaction of German prisoners to their ration conditions documented, and reports filed through the Provost Marshal General's office, a pattern that recurred across multiple camps and multiple prisoner populations. German prisoners, particularly those who had arrived from combat in France or the Eastern Front after extended periods of difficult supply conditions, consistently expressed astonishment at the ration's quality and quantity that was not primarily the astonishment of men who were grateful for better treatment than they expected when that was present, but the astonishment of men who were fulfilling a specific and involuntary recalibration of their understanding of what the war they had been fighting actually was. Chocolate, is not merely a piece of food, it is evidence, and what is evidence of is not something that appears in the concept. German prison reaches its highest monthly volumes as the collapse of the German position in France generates mass surrenders across the Eastern Front. The men arrived at different prisons in a specific way. American intelligence note included a higher proportion of experienced, long-service soldiers whose commitment to National Socialism was often more developed and whose resistance to the psychological implications of American abundance was correspondingly stronger. The prisoners arriving from France in the summer and autumn of 1944 include a much higher proportion of men captured in the massive encirclements and rapid breakdowns that followed the October breakdowns. Men who have been in France for months or weeks rather than years, whose investment in the Nazi state's ideological narrative is correspondingly thinner, and who arrive at American processing facilities in a state of physical exhaustion and psychological disruption that makes them, in the specific assessment of American re-education program officers, more open to the kind of recalibration that the ration experience consistently produces. Captain Edward Davison, an American officer with the military intelligence service who works on prisoner of war programs, documents in his report the specific moment camp administrators and prison welfare officers identified as the inflection point for many German prisoners. The first regular meal of American captivity, and the quality and quantity of what is provided produces a silence and subsequent prisoners described as shared, unspoken contract as something important that has just been demonstrated. The near failure of the American prisoner of war the moment that was closest to undermining the extraordinary strategic opportunity that German prisoners in American camps arrived in the summer and autumn of 1944 in the form of organized resistance by political Nazi prisoners who understand with considerable analytical sophistication what the American is actually doing in camps where the proportion of ideological and National Socialism, particularly in the camps held by SS prisoners, Fallschirmjäger veterans whose training and political conditioning have produced a degree of commitment that the camp administrators find difficult to counteract. Organized prisoner hierarchies form that exert systematic pressure on other prisoners to resist the psychological implications of what they are experiencing. In some camps, prisoners who express positive views of American society or who cooperate with American education programs are subjected to social ostracism, verbal abuse, and in documented cases, physical violence by prisoner-run enforcement networks that mirror, inside the camps, the coercive social structures of Nazi Germany. The kangaroo courts that disorganized prisoner hierarchies established in some facilities that hold mock trials of prisoners deemed insufficiently committed to National Socialism, issuing verdicts that range from social exclusion to physical assault, conducted with formality and procedural seriousness that American camp administrators find both alarming and, in its own way, revealing men who are held as prisoners of war in a country they have been told were fighting to destroy, eating better than they have eaten in years, being treated with the scrupulousness that was required that the American administration extended generally, nonetheless organizing themselves into coercive hierarchies whose purpose is to prevent their fellow prisoners from drawing obvious conclusions. The phenomenon is documented with particular intensity in which becomes one of the primary holding facilities in which American authorities eventually addressed a systematic program of prisoner separation and informal treatment that proves only partially effective. Camp Albert's administrators filed reports in 1944 and 1945 describing an organized prisoner leadership that understands analytical sophistication that the administrators find impressive and threatening that the daily experience of American captivity is the most effective argument against National Socialism that any German prisoner is ever going to encounter, and that the only way to preserve commitment to the regime in men who are experiencing that argument daily is to make the social cost of acknowledging it sufficiently high that personal self-interest overrides the evidence of personal experience. It works for some prisoners. It cannot work forever, because every day in captivity, the evidence accumulates. Prisoners who have been genuinely impressed by American food, American organization, American treatment of captives, who have privately concluded that the war narrative they were provided before capture requires significant revision, find themselves in an environment where expressing that conclusion carries real social costs. American camp administrators respond by separating the most ideologically committed prisoners into segregated facilities, camps like Camp McCain in Mississippi, and the specialized facilities in Ruston and others, and by attempting to identify and promote German prisoners whose own views make them effective interlocutors with their more open-minded fellow captives. The response is partially effective. It does not fully neutralize the most committed Nazi prisoners, but the material evidence of American abundance, the daily ration of chocolate, coffee, and cigarettes continue to operate in the most ideologically resistant prisoners in ways that no social pressure can suppress, because it is operating in the body rather than in the mind, through the simple physical experience of eating well in a country that is fighting a global war and still providing to its prisoners. The re-education program the American government formally institutionalized as an intellectual program in the early 1940s, building on the informal psychological development of American documenting the assessment of killings against Nazi German intelligence service officers assigned to monitor prisoner attitudes, develops a curriculum of newspapers, books, lectures, and discussion groups specifically designed to help German prisoners contextualize what they are already experiencing in their daily lives as prisoners. The program selects approximately 1,500 German prisoner leaders from the camp population, men identified through camp observation and prisoner interviews as possessing both the inclination and the credibility with their fellow prisoners to serve as effective communicators of a more accurate understanding of American society and Nazi education provided, and brings them to a special facility at Fort Kearny in Rhode Island for an intensive 6-week program that combines American newspaper lectures by the German immigrant scholars who had fled the Nazi regime and guided discussions of American history democratic theory, and the specific factual picture of the war's program that German soldiers in captivity had been receiving through increasingly accurate American military. The men who could afford to run the program returned to their camps with documentation to share with them. The camp monitor, filed in months following the program's implementation, described measurable shifts in the prisoner discourse not as comparisons to our American sentiments, nor in the assessment of the program's outcomes, necessarily desirable, but broadening the range of discussion that was socially acceptable and a reduction in the dominance of the most ideologically rigid Nazi positions of social discourse. The program's architects, including psychologists and political scientists from American universities who had been studying German society and psychology and national socialism, understand that the most persuasive argument is not only with what the prisoners encounter when the program even begins. The food in the mess hall, the condition of the camp infrastructure, the behavior of American guards, the newspapers available in the camp library that present an American perspective on the war's progress. The program formalizes and attempts to guide a process that is already occurring organically in the specific and personal way that material abundance communicates about the society producing it in ways that no ideological arguments can replicate. The numbers that American officials track in their program assessments tell a specific story. By 1945, the American prisoner of war program's own internal surveys, conducted through prisoner responses to questionnaires that, while not perfectly reliable as indicators of genuine attitude change, provide the closest available approximation, suggest that a substantial proportion of German prisoners in American captivity have undergone a significant revision of their pre-capture view of the war and of the United States, with the rational experience and the general quality of American captivity conditions consistently identified as the most influential factors. By the war's end in May 1945, the United States had approximately 378,000 German prisoners of war on American soil, in camps distributed across 25 states, housed in facilities that ranged from converted civilian installations in rural Montana to specially constructed installations in Louisiana and Mississippi. The total cost of the American government's housing, feeding, and administering this population, approximately $175 per prisoner per year in 1944, roughly equivalent to the cost of maintaining an American soldier in a stateside training facility in the same year. As a sum, its American counterpart was procuring only concept of the economic value of prisoner labor making the humanitarian and strategic investment in high-quality prisoner treatment essentially self-financing in purely economic terms. The German prisoners had worked in fields, harvesting crops across 20 states, tomatoes and cotton in Louisiana, sugar beets in Colorado and Nebraska, peaches and peanuts in Georgia, apricots and grapes in California, filling labor shortages in the American agricultural sector that had developed as American men and women left farm work for military service and defense industry employment. They had worked at sawmills and canneries in the Pacific Northwest, processing the timber and salmon harvests that fed both military and civilian supply chains. They had built roads and drained swamps and constructed military facilities under the supervision of Army engineering officers who reported in their post-project assessments that prisoner labor productivity in most cases equaled or exceeded what equivalent civilian labor would produce. American farmers who applied to the prisoner of war program received prisoner work rules through agreements negotiated by county agricultural managers with army camp commanders, and the farmers' evaluations filed at the end of each season provide agriculture a remarkable document of American captivity, meeting German prisoner experience in a specific generally more positive than either side's content. Managers of industrial planning facilities, managers of post-war assessments, prisoner relations, consistently noted that adequately fed, adequately housed, and adequately treated German prisoners worked with efficiency that surprised employers who had expected solid compliance rather than genuine engagement. The specific mechanism behind that engagement, documented in the memoirs and oral histories that German prisoners produced in the decades after the war, is consistently identified as the same one that the prisoner at Camp Ruston identified in June 1944. The recognition, produced by daily material experience rather than by any official communication, that the country holding them was operating at a level of productive capacity that made the war's eventual outcome not merely probable but inevitable, and that the treatment they were receiving was not an exception to American values but an expression of them. The returning German prisoners repatriated to Germany beginning in late 1945 and continuing through 1946 and into 1947, since some prisoners were retained for labor purposes or transferred to Allied custody in Europe before final repatriation, brought with them not merely their personal experiences, but the specific, embodied knowledge of what American society was capable of, that those experiences had produced, many were physical evidence as well. Camp canteen receipts for additional food purchases, the American magazines, the newspapers, camp libraries had made available, prisoners the photographs taken of the American guards, and in some cases, the specific food items, German soldier returning to his family in 1945. In 1946, the American handprint in his kit was carrying a more effective argument about the outcome of the war and about why the outcome had been inevitable than any domestication could have produced, because the canned goods were real electric words. His family were managing German civilian rations understood the difference between real and words with an immediacy that no abstract argument about democracy could match. German sociologists and political scientists studying the post-war German population in the late 1940s and 1950s identified former American prisoners of war as a statistically distinguishable demographic whose attitudes toward American society and the democratic values associated with it were measurably more positive than the broader German population, a finding that the sociologists attributed specifically to the prisoner of war experience, and that contributed to the scholarly understanding of how the post-war German-American relationship, which became one of the most consequential bilateral relationships in the entire Cold War, was built on the foundation of personal experience rather than merely institutional agreement. The Marshall Plan, the Berlin Airlift, the NATO alliance, these formal structures of the post-war German-American relationship were built, in part, on a foundation laid in prisoner of war camps across the American South, where German soldiers received rations that exceeded what their own families had told them and had drawn from that experience, a conclusion about American society, known as subsequent political argumentation, could have produced the same war when American officials arrived in Allied Germany to implement the units of the country, and eventually to design and help bring West Germany to the alliance. American officials who had designed and administered the prisoner of war program understood this. The State Department memoranda and War Department analyses that document the strategic rationale for the prisoner of war program's generous ration and treatment standards. Now available in the National Archives and studied by historians of the German-American relationship, describe with considerable analytical clarity the connection between how Germany was treated in defeat and how Germany would behave in the Cold War that the American strategic planners of 1943 and 1944 were already beginning to anticipate. What the prisoner at Camp Ruston in June 1944 understands, holding his chocolate bar in the Louisiana heat and performing his involuntary arithmetic, is not something that will appear in any formal document or official communication. He will not be asked to submit an intelligence report or a psychological assessment. He is a corporal in the 709th Infantry Division who has been taken prisoner, and his observations will not be formally solicited or systematically. But what he understands, what his body, his memory, his experience of 4 years of German anti-fascism are telling him at this specific moment, with a clarity no publication is one of the most strategically significant realizations available to any German soldier. And it is a realization of a radical document, a combination of genuine humanitarian instinct, practical calculation, and strategic foresight that no other power can afford. With a range of things to happen, chocolate bars